Hello, I'm back again. Today it's the fifth and final episode of my five parts ranking series, ranking my favorite 50 albums from the 70s. So today it's going to be the top 10 plus some, or in this case I would say many honorable mentions. It's not just in my opinion, but also in my opinion the best decade in pop rock history, if you have a musical taste like mine. So the honorable mentions would be the Loaded album by Velvet Underground. That just missed out. That would have been my number 51. Great Velvet Underground album, probably one of the at least three best albums, I would say. But the other two would be from the 60s, so they didn't count for this, for the purpose of this video. Then Joni Mitchell, Blue. You have to like her voice. Unfortunately, I'm not one of the people who really, I have to be in a certain mood to enjoy her voice, but this is a brilliant album, can't argue with that. Then it didn't qualify the next Saturday Night Fever because it's a soundtrack album with various artists. But, if it would be a Bee Gees album, if it would be just the songs by the Bee Gees, then it could have been, would qualify as an album by one artist, and it would have been possible to make it a great album with only the Bee Gees stuff, and then it would be in my top 10, I would say. Cat Stevens didn't make the top 50, but he has two albums that, I considered. Teaser and the Firecat and Tea for the Tillerman. I slightly prefer Teaser and the Firecat. Then Roxy Music for Your Pleasure. I think we've had 3 or 4 Roxy Music albums in this top 50, so can't have so many. Can't have much more than 3 or 4 albums by an artist. I think Paul McCartney had the most. He had 4, I think. For Your Pleasure, Roxy Music, classic album, but never one of my all-time favorite Roxy Music albums. Then all albums by Van Morrison in the 70s, except Into the Music, because that was in my top 20. I think it was my 13th favorite album from the 70s according to this list, but all his other 70s studio albums are honorable mentions. He didn't really make anything not awesome between 1968 and mid to late 80s, I would say. Then the next one is Neil Young. We've had him with 2 albums we've had him with 1 album so far, but he's going to have, that's a spoiler, 1 album in the top 10, so he has 2 in the top 50. But honorable mentions would be After the Gold Rush and Zuma. And if I'm in the mood, in a kind of a darker mood, then Tonight's the Night is also great. And then there's 2 great singles acts that I have to mention, and that in my opinion never really had a brilliant masterpiece album. But they had so many great singles, so maybe a best of those groups, would be some of the best music of the 70s in my opinion. 2 glam rock acts, T-Rex and Slade. And now my top 10, my 10th favorite album from the 70s, at least today, is All Things Must Pass by George Harrison. That's the best, that's my favorite. I think that's the best solo album by any Beatle, and it's the only Beatle solo album, maybe next to Ram and Imagine, that, if it would be a Beatle album, would be in the top 5 Beatle albums. A big classic like Abbey Road, Sgt. Pepper, White Album. It's that good. Number 9, Closing Time, the first studio album by Tom Waits. And the only studio album by Tom Waits I really, really like. I respect many of his other albums, and him as an artist throughout the decades I also do respect. But, soon after this album came out, with the second and the third are a bit like this, but already a bit more on the very rough voice side. And from the 4th, 5th album onwards, it's, I really have to be in the mood to listen to it, and I don't really enjoy it often. That's very, very, it's a bit like an actor, like he's putting out an act with this very, monstrous voice in a way. Here it's, it's already hinting in that direction, but here I can listen, here I can enjoy the voice and his songwriting. I think was his pop songwriting, especially one could say, was never better than on this album. Not his most experimental, but I would say it's probably his least experimental of his studio albums, but my personal favorite. Number 8 is on my wall. It's Nevermind the Bollocks. Here's the Sex Pistols by the Sex Pistols. You know, that's the legendary album that kick-started the punk rock revolution, at least in England and Europe. You know, there were several kind of punk albums before that from the US, but I think Nevermind the Bollocks by the Sex Pistols, that was really the cultural landmark that, you know, made punk into a sensation, and many of the things that would be considered punk from this point on, you know, the DNA is on that fantastic album. But besides its cultural importance, you know, it's just a fun album to listen to also. And the 7th album is fun in a different way. It's a bit more, I wouldn't say it's a serious approach, because, you know, Nevermind the Bollocks, you know, Nevermind the Bollocks has something that's kind of hilarious to me, the way Johnny Rotten sings. And the next album is the other big punk album of the 70s, or the other big British punk masterpiece album. It's London Calling. That's definitely not an album that's hilarious, but it's also a fun album. But, you know, they take themselves much more serious. It's much more political, stylistically and musically. It's also more colorful, more varied, and, you know, let's face it, better musically. It's better than Nevermind the Bollocks, which is just one type of song throughout the whole album. But, you know, London Calling, they experiment with so many styles that you can't, you know, that it's really hard even to call it a punk album, because it has reggae songs, funk songs, classic rock songs, poppy stuff like Train in Vain. Yeah, great album. And, you know, on another day, Nevermind the Bollocks would be, I would prefer Nevermind the Bollocks today. It came out like London Calling before Nevermind the Bollocks, because today I'm kind of in the mood to rate the musical brilliance more, but, you know, really from the message that gets communicated, maybe Sex Pistols album is even better as an album. You know, I've read in a great book about the British punk movement, England's Dreaming, also is the title of the book, and that's also taken from a Sex Pistols lyrics by John Savage. And he said that the Sex Pistols were, you know, the Sex Pistols were about running against the wall, and the Clash were about running against the wall but having a reason for that. But the Sex Pistols didn't have a reason for that, so that's always in my memory. And sometimes you just want to run against the wall without having a reason. But today I chose to have London Calling a bit higher than Nevermind the Bollocks. Number 6 is my already spoiled it, kind of spoiled it, my favorite 70s and also my favorite, all-time favorite Neil Young album, Comes a Time, from the late 70s. It's a bit of a sequel to his most successful album. I think maybe he wanted to repeat the success of Harvest from the more early 70s, which was his biggest chart success, biggest seller. It was also kind of successful, but not as successful. But I always preferred that album, you know. I think the songs are really coming from their heart, and yeah, I like the production, and you know, it seems like a very spontaneous album, and this typical stream of consciousness, lyrics and music by Neil Young is, especially the folky side, you know, there's also the rock and roll side, but if you're in the mood for the folky Neil Young stuff, I prefer this to all the other folky Neil Young albums. Number 5 is Chic by Chic, my all-time favorite disco album. You know, I think, especially in the vinyl community, ABBA seem to be such a big thing, and I think, you know, have those people who always, you know, have those ABBA albums in their top 10 favorite albums of all time ever listen to this album. You know, that's 1,000 times much more imaginative, better, even if you're strictly talking about the pop hit appeal, you know, it's even as good as the best of the ABBA albums, but it has so much more to offer, so much more soul and it feels it has more of a it moves me more. It's a much more emotional thing for me than to listen to this, in my opinion, often very sterile, cold ABBA songs. You know, the lyrics aren't really that good on that album. The lyrics are usually like one line, and that gets repeated for 6 minutes. But it's really, it does something with me, that album. It's really outstanding album. Number 4, again on the wall, my favorite Stevie Wonder album, not just of the 70s, of all time. Not very surprising, Songs in the Key of Life. That's probably the most boring favorite Stevie Wonder album one could have. His fantastic double album. I love this album. I think this, you just have to go through the songs that are on this album. Isn't She Lovely? As Another Star, Pastime Paradise. So many songs. Like Ordinary Pain. It's just a fantastic double album. One of the 2 or 3 best double albums of all time. The next album is also one of the 2 or 3 best double albums of all time. So I would say my favorite double albums would be the White Album from the 60s, Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder, and my favorite pure rock and roll album of all time, Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones from 1972. I've done several videos, especially in recent weeks or months, where I talked about this album, so I'll keep it short. It's just, if you want a perfect rock and roll double album, then Exile on Main Street is your album. Number 2 is Atabur de Esmeralda by George Ben. I only have this copy, which is kind of the international version, which was called Brother and had a different cover. The original version is very expensive. It's almost impossible under €100 or dollars to get your hands on a decent copy of that album, but really very good copies or mint copies. It's impossible under 200 or 250 euros, I would say. From Brazilian singer-songwriter. It's a fantastic album. It's a bit in the vein of early 70s albums by Scott Walker or Serge Gainsbourg, but with of course with a tropical flavor, with Tropicalia flavor on it. And it's outside of Latin America probably a very, very underrated artist. I could have also chosen maybe another honor mention, Força Bruta or Forca Bruta. I can't speak Portuguese, I don't know how it's pronounced. That's from 1970s, so it's also from the 70s. That's my second favorite album by him. And he had a great run of albums throughout the 70s, a bit like Stevie Wonder. But those two are my favorites, and Atabur de Esmeralda, or Brother, is by far my favorite George Ben album. And of course, it's one of my all-time favorite albums of all time, since it's my second favorite from my favorite decade. And the number 1, people who know my channel will already know what it is, and I'll keep it very short because I've talked about it now, I think 5, 6 or 7 times in separate videos. One of the most underrated albums of all time, the debut album by Joan Armatrading, Whatever's For Us. Just watch the other videos I did about that album. There's even one video that's entirely just about that album from my series, Most Underrated Albums of All Time. Brilliant singer-songwriter album. It's like Carole King's Tapestry, but without the hits. But it should have had the hits, because the songs are as good, if not better, than the big hits from the Tapestry album, which was, I think, my number 14 or 15. But it flopped. But I'm here to make up for that, so it's my number 1 favorite album from my favorite decade of all time. Whatever's For Us by Joan Armatrading. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, goodbye.